It's a pleasure to welcome you today. This briefing is being organized by UNIDIR, by the Gender and Disarmament Program, which is the program that I lead, in collaboration with our colleagues from another project at UNIDIR, which is the Managing Exits from Armed Conflict project, MEAC for short. We will present today different pieces of research on that touch on the relationship between weapons proliferation, increased militarization, and sexual violence from different angles. And it will be an opportunity for us to hear your thoughts, your views on next steps for this research, and also how to bring these issues in multilateral fora. We are very happy to have you here. I see lots of familiar names, so really nice to have you all here. And the idea is to have like a conversation. So we will have presentations, but then we will also have a Q&A, and we would like to hear from you. So feel free during the Q&A to raise your virtual hand or raise your physical hand, open your camera, talk to us, or post questions in the chat. We're very much hoping this will be an exchange. As we know, sexual and gender-based violence are pervasive in the context of armed conflict, and it can also persist even after the conflict has ended. Sexual violence coupled with impunity can even drive victims to join armed groups and continue with the cycle of violence. This is an issue of public health and social development, but it's also a concern for the arms control and disarmament community. If weapons are used to commit rape in war, then clearly arms control measures should play a role in prevention strategies, in conflict prevention, but also more specifically in conflict-related sexual violence prevention. To discuss these issues, we have gathered brilliant researchers from the UNIDIR team. We'll kick off our discussion with two presentations. The first one by my colleague Hana Salama, researcher with the Gender and Disarmament Program. Hana will provide us with an overview of the linkages between weapons and conflict-related sexual violence. This will be followed by a presentation from Anamika Madhuraj, who is an associate researcher coordinator with the MEAC project at UNIDIR. Anamika will share insights from empirical research carried out with people affected by armed conflict and sexual violence in various contexts. These presentations will be followed by a Q&A where we would like to hear from you. After the Q&A, we'll have the pleasure to hear from Ambassador Camille Petit, who is the permanent representative of France to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. She will deliver concluding remarks. We're extremely honored by the participation of Ambassador Petit here, so thank you very much to her and to her delegation for making this possible. Now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to my colleague Hana for her presentation.
Thank you, Renata, and thank you everybody for taking this time on a Friday to be here with us. As Renata mentioned, I'll be presenting UNIDIR's research on the linkages between the proliferation of small arms and light weapons and sexual violence in conflict. And I'm hoping also that we will have an interactive discussions as we had in some of the previous regional briefings this week. Before I start on the presentation, I just wanted to give a quick overview of the Gender and Disarmament Program. It is a program at UNIDIR where we analyze the gendered impacts of armed violence and examine how gender norms shape the role of weapons in society. We do this work really by carrying out empirical research, hosting dialogues and capacity building activities, and these activities really aim at improving, first of all, women's participation in arms control and disarmament forums, but also looking at broader issues on gender equality. We believe that by translating gender awareness into policy action, we can help ensure that arms control and disarmament deliver for everyone. And our work is really made possible by the generous donors that we have, and these are Canada, Germany, Ireland, Malta, and Norway. So moving on to the issue at hand. As we all know, conflict-related sexual violence is a complex phenomenon which has multiple overlapping causes and enabling factors, some which are rooted in the conflict itself, but some are derived from gender inequality. One of these enabling factors facilitating and fueling the systematic and widespread sexual violence that we see in many conflicts today is the proliferation of weapons, and specifically small arms and light weapons. I call out specifically small arms and firearms in particular because they have been shown to be the weapon of choice by armed groups that are involved in civil war and internal armed conflict, and they are relatively cheap and easy to traffic, to conceal, and to transport. And this has been widely recognized for several years now, including the fact that the UN Secretary General and many other states have also recognized that increasing militarization and the proliferation of these arms are one of the factors which fuel widespread sexual violence in conflict. But however, beyond this recognition, we've seen that there's been little to address the role of weapons as part of efforts in preventing conflict-related sexual violence. So UNIDIR really sought to fill this gap, and first of all, by exploring the evidence which link small arms and light weapons with incidents of CRSV, as well as identifying useful entry points where arms control and disarmament treaties, instruments, tools, and measures can be leveraged to prevent these kinds of crimes. Now to our key findings. Well, before getting into the key findings, I will also provide an overview of how we did this research. First of all, we reviewed publicly available data on CRSV incidents collected by hospitals, humanitarian agencies, the UN, and civil society monitoring projects. We did a desk review and of all sort of UN normative frameworks aimed at preventing and responding to CRSV for the past 20 years. And we conducted key interview with practitioners, for example, women protection advisors who work in several UN peace operations, caseworkers on SGBV in humanitarian agencies, as well as arms control and disarmament experts. And we conducted one focused group discussion in Khartoum, Sudan, with the UNITAM's mission. And this focus group discussion included members of national authorities working to prevent gender-based violence, survivor organizations, civil society, the UN, and international non-governmental organizations. So now to the interesting part, the findings. This report found that the proliferation of small arms and light weapons in conflict can be linked to CRSV in two ways. First, which is obvious, but weapons and ammunition are directly linked because they're used by perpetrators to commit rape, threaten, or coerce individuals into sexual acts against their will, injure and kill survivors and victims of sexual violence. And the second link is indirect, as weapons proliferation contributes to fueling armed conflict, which in turn propagates the conditions that lead to conflict-related sexual violence and also other types of gender-based violence in conflict. On the direct links, we found that in general, there is very limited data on CRSV incidents itself, and more so on incident data, which is linked to weapons data or types of weapons involved in an incident. Most of the data that we reviewed referred to armed actors as the perpetrators, but didn't mention the arms itself or didn't analyze arms as a category. But However, in the DRC, we found that MSF and the Panzi Hospital shared with us some of their data. And the Panzi Hospital is actually a specialized hospital in the care of survivors of CRSV in the DRC. And that data showed that between 40% and 60% of incidents of CRSV involved a weapon. However, when we tried to sort of disaggregate further about what type of weapon this could be, the hospitals at that point did not provide further disaggregation between, for example, like was the weapon a knife or a machete or was it a firearm? We did find one data set from a civil society organization which identified firearms specifically as part of their monitoring of CRSV incidents. And this organization called Insecurity Insight found that in 2022, 70 to 90% of the incidents that they recorded in 6 countries involved a firearm. And these countries are, have conflict in them, and they are DRC, Ethiopia, Nigeria, South Sudan, Sudan, and Ukraine. On the indirect links, we found some studies from South Sudan and the DRC, which has shown, for example, that the same conditions that lead to increasing conflict violence, including militarization and the proliferation of small arms, also lead to an increase in intimate partner violence. As an example of this, most recently in Ukraine, not only has the UN documented many cases of conflict-related sexual violence that were facilitated by weapons, but local CSOs have also documented a 400% increase in the calls to the police about domestic violence and intimate partner violence during the conflict. So this just shows kind of the indirect links with conflict and interpersonal violence. And in addition to both the direct and indirect links, our interviews with practitioners in the field also revealed additional linkages which would require more research to unpack. But just as an example, we found that in conflict, criminal groups often take advantage of the breakdown in borders and the rule of law in a conflict to traffic women and girls for the purpose of sexual exploitation in conflict, as well as traffic weapons. Our interviews revealed that this cross-border trafficking of weapons by criminal groups may include using sexual violence to coerce women into trafficking roles. And in places like the DRC, where criminal armed groups are controlling mining areas, for example, and using profits from trafficking minerals to purchase weapons and sustain the conflict, also are characterized by high level of sexual violence. So based on these linkages, our paper proposes an arms control and disarmament toolbox for the long-term and short-term prevention of CRSV. So this toolbox includes instruments and treaties which address the legal and policy framework of small arms and light weapons control. And these really underpin the long-term and structural prevention of sexual and gender-based violence in conflict. This includes the Arms Trade Treaty, the UN Programme of Action on Small Arms, and the Firearms Protocol. And as an example of how this can support long-term prevention, the Arms Trade Treaty being the first legally binding treaty, it explicitly prohibits parties of the state parties to export arms to countries where there are widespread IHL violations and human rights abuses. And as we all know, CRSV can be an IHL violation, and it is certainly a human rights abuse. In addition to this provision under Article 6, the ATT's Article 7.4 also specifically requires states to conduct risk assessments on the possibilities that weapons transferred can be used to commit or facilitate serious acts of gender-based violence. And of course, I think everyone agrees that sexual violence in conflict is a serious act of GBV. So in that sense, you know, CRSV, the prevention of CRSV is contained in both Article 6 and Article 7 of the ATT. This toolbox, which I can just skip to in the slides. Yeah, the next slide. Is a conceptual framework, and it also includes measures which can be used and at different phases of a conflict to limit the access of weapons to perpetrators of CRSV, thus contributing to more short-term and operational prevention of CRSV. So, for example, in the early stages of a conflict or even before a conflict, weapons-related indicators can be used as an early warning sign of CRSV. During a conflict, the Security Council may wish to leverage arms embargoes to limit the flow of weapons and the possibilities of perpetrators to have access of these weapons based on the fact that sexual and gender-based violence is widespread and systematic, and this has been done before under the SGBV criteria under sanction regimes. And then in the transitional period of conflict, weapons and ammunition management, DDR, as well as community violence reduction, and SSR can all be leveraged to stop the reoccurrence of such violence, ensure that weapons are properly managed, and ensure that there is no impunity for actors who have committed these crimes. So that is an overview of our toolbox. And in conclusion, the report proposed a number of recommendations which can facilitate the integration of gender-responsive arms control into prevention efforts. So one of the important findings that we had, and one of the recommendations that came out of it, is the fact that we need a better understanding of the linkages between the proliferation of weapons and CRSV through collecting more disaggregated data, including by type of weapon. The second is to bring attention to these linkages. So this data and evidence can be used in the Security Council, for example, when deciding on arms embargoes or the conditions of an arms embargo. And it can also be used in arms control and disarmament related forums, such as the ATT Conference of State Parties or the UN POA Review Conference, to bring more attention on this issue and highlight the importance of gender responsive small arms control. And finally, one of the important recommendations has also been to include survivors and survivors associations in decision making at arms control and disarmament at all levels, but specifically at the national level where they have been affected by these arms and weapons, and where they can be there to have their voices heard when making decisions about how arms will be managed in a post-conflict setting. So, as I said, some of these measures are already being leveraged, such as arms embargo, DDR, and SSR, but they're not being put in place in a gender responsive way. And this we think is important because considering the CRSV risks and gender perspectives can contribute to changing gender norms and attitudes, specifically in the security sector and in the security field, which is so heavily male dominated, by promoting women's participation in decision-making about security issues, including arms control and disarmament, and thereby addressing not only the immediate risks of weapons to sexual and gender-based violence, but also addressing the underlying root cause of this kind of violence, which is gender inequality. That's all from me, and thank you very much. I'd like to pass it to my colleague, Anamika.
Thank you so much, Hana. Hi, everyone. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So I'll be sharing findings from UNIDIR's Managing Exits from Armed Conflict Project, or MIAC for short, based on our recent research in the Lake Chad Basin as well as Colombia. And as you can tell from our logo of logos here of our donors and partners, that we are an all of UN effort, and our project seeks to better understand how and why people exit armed groups and what it means for them to fully and sustainably return to civilian life. Next slide, please. So let me begin with the Lake Chad Basin, where we looked at the experiences of women and girls associated with Boko Haram. Next slide, please. So in the Lake Chad Basin, MIAC has been collecting data since 2020, and we've conducted 19 surveys so far, interviewing women, men, girls, and boys as young as 12. And alongside surveys, we do qualitative research to explore topics that are less suited for structured questionnaires. The findings I'm presenting today are based on interviews and focus groups held between February and October 2024 in 3 different contexts, in Cameroon, Chad, and Nigeria, with both former associates of Boko Haram as well as community members. Next slide, please. From all these focus groups and interviews, we've brought together certain findings, and our first key finding relates to forced marriage. We found that Boko Haram factions have systematically engaged in sexual and gender-based violence, with forced marriage being extremely widespread. Girls, widows, and even married women are unfortunately not spared. In Nigeria, 59% of women and girls in our sample reported being married while with the group, and many more than once. They've had to remarry after the death or capture of their husbands, which can mean in practice multiple forced marriages. Second, most of these women and girls remain married to their so-called Boko Haram husbands even after exit, over 80% in Nigeria. Legal avenues for divorce are rare, and economic dependence as well as fear of losing their children if they divorce often makes separation impossible. And this really begs the question as to what reintegration can really look like when you're still married to someone from an armed group. Our third finding is that some reintegration efforts actually unintentionally reinforce harm. In Nigeria, women and girls who exited alone were often held in transit centers until their Boko Haram husbands, so the same men that they were forced to marry, also exited. And they were often reunited by authorities with no clear indication of consent. In some cases, assistance in these transit centers were also often channeled through men, forcing unmarried or widowed women to rely on male intermediaries, some of whom actually withheld a portion of that aid as their payment. Our fourth finding is that many women and girls self-reintegrate, returning to crisis-affected communities with little or no formal support. Even those who surrender formally are often deprioritized because they're not seen as a security threat. And as a result, assistance remains geared towards men, despite so many of these women caring for multiple children and facing severe livelihood insecurity. Next slide, please. In terms of recommendations, first, we need to stop viewing women and girls exiting armed groups solely as victims, wives, or daughters. Many play diverse roles, fighting or providing logistical support in sustaining armed groups, and yet DDR responses continue to overlook them. And to change this, we need to meaningfully include women and girls in DDR design, whether that's through advisory mechanisms or through sustained support for grassroots women's organizations. Second, their socioeconomic independence must be prioritized. So as mentioned, reintegration often takes place in climate-affected, crisis-prone areas where women face the greatest constraints. So support could look like access to land and credit, or climate-smart livelihoods, or financial and literacy training, all to build long-term resilience. Next slide, please. So next, I will go through our findings from Colombia, specifically the research that we did with the NASA indigenous community. They're based in the north of Cauca, looking at how sexual violence intersects with conflict dynamics. Next slide, please. So this particular research draws on interviews and focus groups our team conducted in July 2024 with community actors who have direct visibility on sexual violence and recruitment in the region. Specifically, the NASA Indigenous Guard, so they are a community protection force. We also engaged the leaders from ASEAN's Women's Department, which is part of a local Indigenous governance body. Next slide, please. Our first finding is that some survivors of sexual violence are joining armed groups in search of justice. This is because the mechanisms available in their communities, especially the indigenous justice system in this particular case, often fail to deliver accountability. So survivors face disbelief, re-victimization, and light or absolutely no penalties for perpetrators, leaving them without support, redress, or protection. Second finding is that these dynamics occur in a broader context of unequal gender norms and roles. And these norms shape how violence is responded to and continue to contribute to a culture of impunity. Third, community perceptions are deeply divided. So men in particular tended to externalize the problem, attributing sexual violence to armed groups rather than acknowledging its presence within the community and the role of local men in it. So this denial, of course, undermines efforts to confront the issue and reinforces harmful gender stereotypes. Finally, while most survivors are women and girls, we also had accounts of boys and men experiencing sexual violence, though these cases are even less recognized or supported. Next slide, please. Our recommendations target both institutions and authorities as well as community members. For authorities, we recommend strengthening policy and guidance to improve how sexual violence cases are reported, tracked, and resolved. Confidential data collection is a must, and this would help assess justice outcomes and guide improvements. Institutions also, of course, need clearer roles and regular training, especially when it comes to male survivors, to reduce stigma and improve case handling. At the community level, we call on members to report cases, provide support, and create safe spaces. This includes denouncing machismo, strengthening family support networks, and participating in efforts to challenge harmful norms and prevent violence. Next slide, please. So the findings from both Lake Chad Basin as well as Colombia that I discussed today are linked to these reports on the slide, which you're welcome to access using the QR codes in display. Thank you so much for listening, especially on a Friday afternoon. And back to you, Renata.
Thank you very much, Hana and Anamika, for walking us through the findings of these different research projects. As people who, for the people in the audience who are familiar with UNIDIR, we conduct a lot of research and we make our reports are available online. So you can always, go to our website and read them. But we also understand everybody's super busy and our reports can be quite long. So we organize these sessions where we can present kind of, an overview just to give you a taste of what the research was and what were the findings. And in the case today, we had a broader research presentation from Hana, where she outlined overall linkages between conflict-related sexual violence and weapons proliferation, making the case, what we want to do is to make a case, why the arms control and disarmament community should care and how they can address this in their specific context and fora where arms control and disarmament measures are being discussed. So we highlighted, the Arms Trade Treaty, the UN POA, as possible fora for this discussion. And then what Anamika is showing us is, how these issues occur at the community level, and what are the stories of people impacted by armed conflict. And these stories, they are a bit more complex that we can always, articulate in broader generalizations. But you can see in your in the research that Anamika presented, there was a lot of very participatory methodology where there was engagement with survivors, and you could even hear accounts, first-hand accounts of how people are dealing with this issue at the community level. And as Anamika pointed out, how impunity and sense of impunity can also be a driver that continues to fuel conflict, and even, be a driver for survivors of sexual violence to join armed groups. So it's a super complex relationship. It's not a one-way connection, but really a multifaceted connection between those issues. And so we prepared some questions that we would like to pose to our audience today. These are just some suggestions. We are very interested in hearing your views. But initially, we thought about discussing, these findings. The reports that were presented today, they come from a range of the data provided comes from a range of countries. Hana mentioned some countries in Africa, also in Europe, Ukraine. Anamika presented research from South America, Colombia, but also Africa. How do the findings of the reports presented today apply to your regional realities or to your national realities, to the work that your country is trying to do at the international level as well? Do you have good practices to share regarding data collection, but also regarding programs that aim to support survivors or to prevent gender-based violence, to prevent conflict-related sexual violence? As we know, gender-based violence is an umbrella term, a broader term where we use to address different types of violence perpetrated on the basis of gender. And forced marriage is one of the cases that Anamika presented, is certainly a case of gender-based violence. Rape as well. Enforced sexual slavery, forced prostitution, and femicides are also examples of gender-based violence. And we know weapons are used to facilitate all sorts of gender-based violence. What are new areas for research that you think would be useful for UNIDIR to pursue in terms of linking increased militarization, proliferation of weapons, and sexual and gender-based violence? What would be helpful from your perspective? We are interested in hearing your thoughts. How can we best support women and girls exiting armed groups? I think that's very much a discussion that we see in the context of DDR processes. So maybe for the diplomats who are joining the call today, they also have experience participating in DDR-related discussions. So how can we best support women and girls exiting armed groups? We know they face a lot of challenges regarding, invisibility. There is a sense that you need to bring the quote-unquote men with the guns for the negotiation table, and the voices and perspectives of women and girls are often lacking and missing in those negotiations. Another question that we have here is what are strategies that can be used to integrate, different perspectives, but perspectives that are informed by, ethnic and cultural considerations, to prevent and address sexual violence in conflict settings. And a final question is about, these issues, they really need to be dealt with in an ethic and sensitive way. How can we ethically and sensitively support programs, for instance, providing access to justice for indigenous survivors of sexual violence? Well, this is a menu of questions for discussion. but it's just to, stimulate the conversation. We are very much interested in hearing your thoughts. What did you think was striking about this research? What surprised you? What would you like to learn more? Please, you can take advantage of the fact, that we have Anamika and Hana on the call. They can expand more on each research. So we have about 15 minutes for a Q&A, and I would be very much interested in hearing from colleagues in the call. If they have any questions to share, any comments, any feedback, something that wasn't clear, feel free to raise your virtual hand or open your camera, raise your physical hand, or put comments in the chat. You will see in the chat, we have been sharing the links of the reports that were presented. But yeah, very much keen to hear from our colleagues today if they have any questions, comments, suggestions of how we can continue to highlight and, raise awareness about the issue of conflict-related sexual violence in relation to arms control and disarmament processes. So the floor is open. I see maybe our audience today is a bit quiet. Uh, well, I can talk a little bit more about how we are seeing these issues in the context of the arms control and disarmament processes that we monitor and we follow. I believe the next Conference of States Parties of the Arms Trade Treaty is a good opportunity to highlight these issues, and we at UNIDIR are available to collaborate with states and stakeholders on that. And there are also discussions on ammunition management that would merit considerations of gender-based violence. And I think the issues we presented today are good hooks for that too. I don't know, Hana and Anamika, would you like to share a bit more about, for instance, Hana, follow-up project that you are working on this? And then Anamika as well, other activities related to this, the research that you will pursue in the next few months, for instance?
Sure. Thanks, Renata, for giving me this opportunity to discuss our follow-up project. But I'm confident that there will be some questions and some comments from this group, as I see some familiar faces as well. I think Austria would like to take the floor, so maybe I'll let them before I speak.
Yes, good to see you, Suzanne.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the very interesting presentation. I was having trouble on my cell phone finding the raise hand button. As always, thank you really for this very good research work once again done by UNIDIR, and very helpful experience from the ground. I have a very particular question, especially when it comes to gender-based violence and domestic violence, so to speak. One thing that has come up a bit, but maybe not too much, especially in the context of the ATT, is of course, if you're exporting certain small arms and you would take into account the GVB provisions within the ATT, one of the challenges you might find is, of course, who will be the end user And one of the things in that context that I have been thinking about is there a conversation to be held also about firearms licensing in certain countries? So who is able to actually obtain certain weapons? This is obviously a national prerogative, but I think until now there hasn't been much discussion on that, maybe because of the complexity. But given your research experience, I was just wondering if you have ever given a thought to that, or if you could enlighten us a bit further. And once again, thanks for the conversation and also an excellent idea to do it on a regional level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Lovely to see you and to hear from you. Thanks for the question about firearms licensing and how that can also be a way to mitigate GBV committed with firearms. I'll let Hana talk a little bit about this, and then if other people would like to take the floor. I see Margaret and Cusack added a comment in the chat. So maybe Hannah, you can talk a bit more, and then we address the comment from Margaret N as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you, Suzanne, for this very relevant comment about the ATT process. And this is, I think, really relevant in terms of the initiative, which started 2 years ago to collect mitigation strategies, national mitigation strategies from states parties. So I'm not sure if Austria saw that there was a questionnaire that was circulated about the legal and policy framework, the domestic legal and policy framework for preventing GBV. And that, I think, included questions related to firearms licensing and how these are attributed, and if there's any like GBV risk assessments in relation to domestic firearm licensing. And I find that this information, I think, from the point of view of an exporting state would be really important. So in addition to any data that the exporting state can get on domestic violence as perpetrated by small arms or firearms, having knowledge about the legal and policy frameworks regulating civilian firearm use, but also do victims have recourse to justice, and how are they treated within this system, and how can the legal frameworks, either prevent or also uh, take into account gender-based violence. So I would hope that states would revive this initiative because it was or continue with this initiative because it was very informative. I think a number of states did fill out the questionnaire, and we're hoping that more do, so we can sort of analyze which mitigation measures can be leveraged by exporting states or can be considered when making export decisions. So we don't want to also ask too much of exporting states. So it's really a good practice to look like, well, in certain countries, there are, gender sensitive firearms licensing, and this could be a really great information to look for when making export decisions, in addition to the data on gender-based violence. So yeah, I think this would be my not so short answer to your comment. Over to you, Renata.
Yes, I remember we did research about this before, and there are countries that have licensing guidelines where they deny gun license to those that have been convicted of domestic violence, convicted of GBV, convicted of intimidation, and convicted of stalking. So I can share that with you also, Suzanne. This was part of a research we did a few years ago, but we collected some examples that there is a kind of an analysis that showed that there has been had success in curbing intimate partner violence. And then I also know this organization Solda Paz in Brazil. So they do a lot of research in this area, and they showcase that there is a law in Brazil that actually, when someone comes to report intimate partner violence to the police asks, was there a weapon involved? And then if so, they can go and seize the weapon from the home. So there are different kind of this kind of, as Hana was saying, mitigation policies, but we don't have a complete overview. So there is a value, I think, in collecting them and sharing them and in giving visibility, especially if they work, right? It's good to have kind of an understanding of what works in this field too. I hope this answers your question, Susan, but I'll also follow up with you via email. The comment we have here in the chat is about supporting socioeconomic needs of people at risk of domestic violence and how that is crucial, and funding is a challenging. I think funding is really an issue that we see across the board. Maybe Anamika, would you like to also address this? Was funding and resources something that came up in the research that you presented too?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Renata. Yeah, and thank you, Margaret. I think the point you raised is obviously a very critical one, especially in the times that we find ourselves right now. And yeah, going back to the research, I think in the Lake Chad Basin particularly, we saw that economic dependence, keeps many women in coercive or violent relationships long after they've exited, said armed group. So survivors repeatedly told us that, without stable livelihoods or alternatives, they simply had no way out. So addressing domestic violence, it isn't just about protection, it's also about economic empowerment and stability. And as you noted, Margaret, I think funding, it's obviously a major hurdle. And what we'd advocate for is long-term flexible funding for reintegration, and not just emergency assistance or health support, but it's to ensure that women can access stable livelihoods, have safe housing, and have social support without having to rely on potentially abusive partners that they were coerced to marry. And we, of course, also strongly advocate for investing in survival-led and women's organizations, grassroots level organizations, because they're often doing the hardest work with the least amount of resourcing. So yeah, I think when it comes to funding, those are some of my immediate thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anamika. I think we see, not in the case of small arms and light weapons, because the international processes that we follow don't have victim assistance provisions, but in other arms control and disarmament process where there is victim assistance provisions, we also hear about, in the case of landmines or cluster munition, that funding is an issue to support victims. So it's certainly something we see across the board. We still have a couple of minutes in case anyone would like to ask a question or make a comment. I think people are still reflecting on the presentations. Okay. Maybe Hana and Anamika, do you have some final words before I give the floor to Ambassador Camille Petit?
Yeah, thank you, Renata. Maybe just to share initially what you asked about the follow-up project. So the first report that you can download on our website really gave us an overview of what long-term, how arms control and disarmament treaties can support prevention of CRSV in the long term, what already exists, and what can we also do to bolster that. And the next one will look at really the more operational measures for arms control, such as arms embargoes, weapons and ammunition management, DDR measures. And it will look at how, because in UN peace operations, who are often operating in very high conflict areas where there is widespread CRSV, it will look at how these measures can be leveraged by UN peace operations, and especially in conjunction with the prevention efforts on sexual violence in UN peace operations. So I'm sure you're all aware, but most, if not all, peace operations are mandated to prevent conflict-related sexual violence, and they do have capacity and resources to do so. And the idea is to strengthen that capacity and maximize resources by integrating the work that the mission is also doing on arms control, disarmament, and weapons and ammunition management. So this will be hopefully ready in the next couple of months. And if anyone specifically is interested in this area of work, UN peace operations, their mandates and their activities in relation to CRSV and arms control, please feel free to contact me. I'll put my email in the chat as well. Thank you. Over to you, Anamika.
Thank you, Hana. Thank you, Renata. Maybe I will quickly reflect on 2 points from each of the case study that maybe I didn't really have time to reflect on, and maybe didn't come through so clearly. I think in Colombia, a promising practice that we engaged in was that this was an entirely participatory approach. So we collaborated with the Nasa indigenous community, we worked with the local governance body, and it from the very beginning. So in terms of drafting the research questions all the way to creating joint recommendations, this was an entirely participatory approach. And I think there is some value there in ensuring cultural sensitivity, making sure that it's context relevant. And so, yeah, from Colombia, maybe one thing to highlight is what it means to be co-partners in research and what it means to co-produce research, in a community. And then for the Lake Chad Basin, maybe one thing to reflect on is just, I think this particular case study and the findings that we presented, it really, points to this question of how we understand exit from an armed group in the context of a conflict. So a lot of the DDR frameworks often assume that once someone exits an armed group, their ties to that group is completely severed and entirely dissolved. But for the women who were forcibly married within these armed groups, we see that's not the case. Many of them remain legally, economically, and socially bound to their so-called Boko Haram husbands. And so, what does it mean to respect women's agency when it comes to DDR programs? It's obviously that we must avoid this one-size-fits-all assumptions, because some women, of course, want to end these marriages, but they cannot because of all these barriers I mentioned. But then there are also women who actually describe their husbands as caring and supportive. So there are cases where clearly women want to separate but lack the means, but there's a lot of nuance here. And so ultimately DDR programs and reintegration should be about restoring choice. It's not about imposing a path forward that we think is right, but rather creating the conditions in which a woman can make her own decisions. And it's all about respecting agency. So yeah, maybe those are some quick observations from both cases.
Thank you very much, Hana and Anamika, for sharing more about your work. Now I would like to conclude this segment and move to our concluding remarks. We have the honor of being joined today by Ambassador Camille Petit, who is the permanent representative of France to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. She has an impressive career in the Foreign Service. As a diplomat, she has represented France in many parts of the world and held positions in the UN as well. And she is a champion of gender perspectives across arms control and disarmament. We're very happy to hear from her now. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Renata. You are too kind in your observations. But I would like, first of all, to congratulate you. I don't see my, sorry, sorry. I think we forgot to open actually the video link. Sorry. No, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to provide some concluding remarks. But I think that taking a regional angle to your discussions is extremely useful. And if you allow me, I would like just maybe, as you proposed, to first give a few feedback on the discussions, the very, very rich analysis. And thank you to both our researcher, Anamika and Hana, who really provided a lot of insight into these complex issues. And in this second part, I would like to maybe look at the responses. So your toolbox, it was extremely useful, but maybe with a specific focus on women, peace and security, and the French feminist foreign policy. So first of all, I think that today's presentations and discussions have really helped us to improve our knowledge on the direct and indirect links between armed conflict, weapons proliferation, and conflict-related sexual violence. And I think that too often we look at these issues in silos, and it's important really to have an integrated and holistic view of all this. It is clear that these issues are not separate. They are deeply interconnected matters. And of course, they shape the patterns of violence, not only in the battlefield, but beyond, and you mentioned it, reaching people's homes. So really your research underscored how international security challenges, such as the illicit arms flows, are really intertwined with issues often considered domestic. And it also showed how violence against women and girls exists on a continuum. And you mentioned it, that there is, of course, there is an increase of gender-based violence during a conflict, but it persists well beyond the conflict. And that's where it's even more difficult to end it. And of course, behind all the statistics that you gave, there are lives. And so your analysis put people, survivors, displaced communities at the center of the analysis, and all your interviews were extremely useful. And indeed, we need to further our understanding of the physical, psychological, and also socioeconomic consequences of gender-based violence. But of course, women are not, and girls are not only victims. They are clearly part of the solution. So we have to see how we can totally involve them in the solution. So if I look at the responses at the multilateral and national level, and including the regional level, so we clearly, I mean, as we mark the 25th anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. And this is really a very important stone, because we know that through this agenda, we had action plans. For instance, France had 3 action plans. We are now preparing the 4th one after 2025. And of course, these action plans include DDR, SSR actions, and with a specific focus that enable to intertwine the responses that focus on against gender-based violence, but also security sector reform, and then the link with arms control and disarmament. This is something that we also tried to integrate into our foreign policy. So clearly the French foreign policy has taken up the issue of feminist foreign policy as soon as 2019. So there is clearly a step up at that time. We already had feminist foreign policy drafted by Sweden, Canada, and Luxembourg. So we followed the movement, but now there are 15 countries, and we encourage a lot of countries, of course, to take this same step. What we consider to be a foreign feminist policy is when a state places the rights of women and girls, as well as gender equality, really at the center of its foreign policy. And that's what we tried to do in the different sectors of our foreign policy. And if I look at the, the step up, as I mentioned, clearly we just announced, our new international strategy for a feminist foreign diplomacy that covers the period from 2025 to 2030. We hope that it will enable us to really reinforce not only our commitments, but that can be read in the strategy, but clearly promote a new dynamic, including with our partners. So I'm going to go through the diplomacy, just a few pillars: defending rights and freedom, fostering participation and representation in all decision-making processes, which is very important in the disarmament field, fighting against gender-based inequalities. As you mentioned, this is the root causes that leads to violence, combating gender-based violence and violence against women, and mobilizing fundings to progress toward gender equality, because as you mentioned it, of course, we need fundings to cover to promote and implement all these different projects. So this year, the fourth Feminist Foreign Policy Conference will be held in Paris in June 2025. And this will be really an opportunity to promote this topic. And we will also co-chair the Feminist Foreign Policy Group that will take place in 2025. So with all this, I would like maybe to say that it's good to have a strategy at the national level, but you need to implement it. And that's the reason why all the different embassies and permanent missions through the diplomatic network needs to have a roadmap for gender equality. And so we just drafted, we reinforced our team, and so we have a counselor dedicated to this topic, and we have now a roadmap, especially that focuses on disarmament and arms control. So you mentioned ATT. I would like to say France, for instance, is the head of was the head of the team that looks at diversion, how to avoid diversion. But also we promote a lot the POA on small arms and light weapons. We promoted also the consideration of craft weapons in the POA and supported the chair, Maritza Chan, who gave a special focus also on gender issues. And with Germany, we were at the initiative of the adoption of the global framework on ammunition that needs to also take into account gender-based violence. And so we will have a meeting in June that we prepare for the meeting of state parties in 2027. And definitely we will look closely at these issues to fight against gender-based violence. And we will need your insight, of course, to make sure that all these multilateral frameworks that are really necessary can focus on very concrete solutions. And I know that you always help us in that regard. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your words, but most of all for your actions. We really appreciate France's leadership in this area, and we look forward to working together, as you highlighted, in the ATT, in the UN POA, and the Global Framework on Ammunition. Now I would like to close this meeting by thanking everyone that joined, thanking my fellow panelists, Hana and Anamika, and wishing everyone a lovely Friday and a good weekend ahead. Thank you. Goodbye.